Hello everyone. Welcome to day 13 session of DevOps Complete course. My name is Chandrasekhar, and in today's course we'll be talking about Terraform. So today we'll try to learn what Terraform is. A kind of topic which you must know, which is highly going to be used in year 2025. If you know Terraform, if you know about automation, if you know how to use Terraform to create resources, certainly you are eligible to get highly payable job there in IT industry in year 2025. So let's try to understand what we are going to learn today in our day 13 session. So in our day 13 session, I'll be talking mostly about what is Terraform. Then we will talk about the problems which were without Terraform, because it's pretty much evident that it's not as in from day one IT industry has started using Terraform. There was certain theory, certain past also. There were certain other tools or other frameworks which were used even before Terraform. We'll try to understand that thing also. Then we will try to understand the concept of API as a code, and then we'll talk about use cases, and then we'll talk about problem statement and solutions. So let's start with what Terraform is to begin with. Okay, so now Terraform is basically an infrastructure as a code. We all know about this. The Terraform is an infrastructure as a code, and we'll gradually get to know about what infrastructure as a code is. We learned in our day 12 session also about Ansible, and there also we learned how Ansible is used to create resources. And certainly Terraform is going to be different from Ansible while creating resources. And that is what I gave an example also in my day 12 session, wherein I said that in case if you're using Ansible to create resources rather than using Terraform, it's like you are using some you are not taking utmost or maximum advantage of Ansible as a tool whose main purpose is not to create infrastructure for you rather than to configure infrastructure for you. That we learned in our day 12 session. In day 13 session, we'll talk in our today's session, we'll talk mostly about Terraform. We'll talk about theory of Terraform and what Terraform is, and we'll try to understand what are the problems without Terraform also, and we'll try to understand various scenarios and use cases of usage of Terraform. Okay, so let's try to understand from DevOps engineer's perspective, because that is what the job you're going to get after completion of this course. After getting well known to Terraform and other tools, you will be getting a DevOps engineer job. So now let's try to understand from DevOps perspective. Say you are a DevOps engineer. For example, you are a DevOps engineer, and you being a DevOps engineer is looking for a job in any man company. Certainly, you will be thinking about that. So, DevOps engineer, from DevOps engineer perspective, what we will do is you started working in a company. For example, you started working in a company. Maybe you got a job in Google. Okay, you got a job in Google, or let's not give a name which is very much specific to a cloud vendor, because Google itself is making GCP. And in case if I'll try to explain about AWS and Azure, then you might be confused. So, for the sake of viewers, better understanding, what I'll do is I'll take a general company. For example, you worked for a company, say maybe I'll say IBM. Okay, or you worked for a company which is say TCS. You worked for these companies in your experiences. Okay, so now when you have worked for companies like IBM and TCS, what the job what your day-to-day activities will be. One of your day-to-day activity will be to create resources where applications will run, because eventually what's going to happen is for application to run properly, you must have infrastructure in the first place. You must have servers in the first place where applications will be deployed, and after it's deployed, it reaches to end customers, it reaches to end users, and end users will be able to use those applications. But yes, those application has to be created, has to be deployed on some servers, which will be your one of the job to create infrastructure on. So for example, IBM and TCS, what they are doing is they are using AWS. They are using AWS as the cloud vendor to create infrastructure. So now what you have done is you have created hundreds of EC2 instances. You have created 50 S3 bucket. You have created 25 RDS databases, which is pretty much needed for any organization to work. You need storage, you need compute, you need databases. So for example, you have done this, and in order to do this like a good DevOps engineer, what you have done is you have written some sort of automation script. In order to do this, you have written some sort of automation script. Now automation script, and this word automation, I'm iterating from our day one itself. It's very much important in 2025. You must have good knowledge in automation in order to excel in IT industry, because of the challenges, because of huge competition. You must be very good in automation. So what you have done being a good DevOps engineer, in order to go be a good DevOps engineer, you have written some sort of automation script to create these resources. You have written a cloud formation template. CFT. You have created CloudFormation template to create, you have written CloudFormation template to create these resources: 100 EC2 instances, 50 S3 bucket, and 25 RDS instances, because your organization needed to have these resources to be created. Fine, you're good at that and you have written it. But now what happened? There could be some conflict in between AWS and your organization. There, and that conflict could be for any reasons. That conflict could be due to high cost, which AWS incurs, and maybe not good support which AWS came up with, or maybe not that easy maintenance which perhaps AWS came up with. I'm not saying that AWS does these things, but I'm just giving you one situation. AWS for some reason increased costs, and maintenance is not that proper for some reason. Then what your organization will say: no, no, AWS is not that good, now I have to move to another cloud vendor. So now your organization is emphasizing you to create same sort of resources, but this time resources has to be created there in Azure. So now what happened? Another cloud vendor came, and your company wanted to move into Azure cloud from AWS cloud. So basically you have to migrate everything. Now you have to create these 100 virtual machines in Azure. You have to create, you have to create 50 storage accounts or blob storage in Azure. You have to create Cosmos DB, or you have to create SQL DB in Azure. You have to again create these many resources. Now in Azure, you cannot write CloudFormation template. You have written CloudFormation template, which worked only on AWS, because CloudFormation template is very much specific to AWS. Now what you have done in Azure, in Azure again to automate same thing, because you were very good in AWS, and I'm not saying that you are not that good in Azure, but I'm just saying that one is working day in, day out in AWS will be certainly good in CFT. And you are good in CFT at this point. So now what you have done, in order to create resources in Azure, you have learned another automated script which we call as ARM. ARM, which is Azure Resource Manager. So you have learned this also, and after learning these things, you have created these all resources again in automated fashion. Again, you have written plenty of script and you have created these all resources, which is very much different from the one which you have written in AWS, a cloud formation template. Now, again, your company ran with these all resources with the Azure template, which you have written for a couple of months or years. And again, company thought this time to move into on-premises. Now, what company said? No, no, this time I want to move into on-premise, right? So what company thought? Company thought that fine, I'll make my own data centers. I don't want cloud, and in my own data centers I have to create resources. So company said that you have to create same sort of resources in on premises also. Now in on premise, to automate what you have done, in on premise to automate thing, what we do, we use OpenStack, and in order to automate things by using OpenStack, we use heat template. We don't have any template like ARM, which is specific for Azure, or CFT, which is specific for AWS. In order to automate things in on-premise for the usage of OpenStack, we use heat template. Now, what you have done is, again, you started learning heat template also to create same sort of resources in on-premise. So now what happened with the change? What you're learning here, where I'm going up to, I hope you're able to follow at this point. In order to migrate from one set of infrastructure, one setup of infrastructure to another setup, you have to learn separate programming language. You have to learn separate set of scripting, and it involves lots of script, lots of effort, and lots of time you have to spend in order to learn these all things. So you're not basically learning about any specific cloud vendor. You're learning about some automated automation cloud template, which will be used to create resources there in cloud, which is very tough to manage at multiple times, right? So let's try to brief what we have seen. What are the challenges? So challenges without, and that was one of the topic which we thought we will talk about: challenges without Terraform, which companies were facing without and in few minutes I'll tell you how Terraform is the solver to this problem. But let's try to understand challenges without Terraform at this point of time. So now what you have done is, you are a DevOps engineer, and in order to create resources there in AWS cloud, what you have done, you have written something which is called CFT, cloud formation template. Again, your company decided to migrate from AWS to Azure. Now, in order to create same sort of resources in Azure, what you have to do, you have to write another sort of automation script, which is ARM, which is Azure Resource Manager. Again, your company decided to move on to on-premise setup, onto on-premise setup. And this is one of the use case I'm talking about. In few minutes, I'll talk about another use case also. And your company decided to move to on-premise, and in order to move to on-premise, what you have done, you have to write some other things to which we call as heat template, which is very much specific to what? It is very much specific to OpenStack, right? Which is very much specific to OpenStack. So now you have to learn everything in order to be good in automation, in order to be automate everything. Because certainly you have to automate things. In 2025, you cannot survive in IT industry without automation. That is for sure. Every company now is looking for automation. So now in order to survive in 2025, what you have to do, you have to learn everything, which is very challenging. So now this was one of the use case. Use case number two, which is hybrid cloud. So I'll talk about one more use case, which is hybrid cloud infrastructure. Where in hybrid cloud infrastructure, companies nowadays are very much good, very much into hybrid cloud. In multi, what is hybrid cloud? What do you mean by hybrid cloud? Hybrid cloud means, for just for the sake of my viewers who do not know what is hybrid cloud is nothing but multi-cloud setup. So companies are into AWS also, Azure also, GCP also. So for example, you worked for the company which is TCS, and TCS is trying to use TCS is thinking that, okay, for the support of for the compute and storage support, I'll go to AWS. TCS decided that for compute and for EC2 and S3, I'll go to TCS, I'll go to AWS. And then again, it's decided that for Azure DevOps, for DevOps setup, for DevOps platform. So Azure DevOps comes up with its own platform, which is called ADO. ADO is a service of Azure by means of which Azure offers only DevOps. So what company has decided to go into Azure for DevOps platform, and to for the support of for having EC2 instances, virtual machine or S3 bucket created, company has decided to go into AWS. It's a kind of hybrid setup. But you being a DevOps engineer have to automate everything. You cannot say that, okay, fine, if it's AWS, I'll create manually, and if it's Azure, I'll write ARM template. No, you cannot do that. You have to write script. So what you have to do again in this kind of setup, if you are thinking about any cloud specific automation script, then you will write CFT. For AWS and for Azure, you will write ARM template. You will do like this. And again, it will be a tough task, because by this way, again, you have to learn multiple scripts, which will be very tough for you to manage. So now what happens in this case is, in such situation, Terraform is a lifesaver. Terraform provides you a interface by means of which you will be able to manage across multiple cloud. So now how Terraform is a solution to this? Let's try to understand. Now, I'll start with a very basic thing. Now, AWS being a cloud vendor, what it does is it offers all its service on some sort of API. Same thing is done by Azure also. So what AWS does, AWS exposes all its services on some sort of API. Same thing is done by Azure also. In Azure also exposes all its service on some sort of API. Azure has its own API. AWS has its own API. Azure and AWS, and in that context, all the cloud vendor. I mean, I'm just giving the name of Azure and AWS. It can be anything. It can be Oracle Cloud. It can be IBM Cloud. It can be anything, any cloud which you can think about. It can be Google Cloud. Any of the cloud exposes their services on API. Now, what Terraform says is, instead of using separate language to interact with that cloud, you use only one language, which is Terraform. And that is where Terraform came up with. So Terraform says very simple thing. Terraform says that instead of configuring Python code or any other separate programming language to interact with these APIs, you just learn one programming language, and this programming language will interact with AWS API also. This programming language will interact with Azure API also. So Terraform, how Terraform does it, and this is one of the reason why Terraform is able to work with different cloud vendor, because Terraform is not writing script which is specific to that cloud vendor. Rather than Terraform just interacts with the API of that respective cloud vendor. You just have to learn one programming language, which is Terraform. And as you create the configuration file of Terraform, which is by using provider.tf or config.tf, various sort of Terraform formats are there, which I'm going to explain in our next session itself, how to write these all programming languages, how to write these all Terraform configuration file. I'll explain everything. Don't worry. So now what happens with that configuration file? With that configuration file, Terraform is going to interact with all the cloud vendors, is going to interact with their respective APIs, and is going to help you to create resources. So now what DevOps engineer has to do? Now you see how DevOps engineer's life will be so easy. DevOps engineer, DevOps engineer, in order to interact with AWS, will write Terraform code. Terraform code. This Terraform code will interact with AWS API and will create resources there in AWS. And same goes to Azure also. Same goes to GCP also. And same goes to on-prem also. Same is applicable to on-premise also. Right? So Terraform works for on-premise also. Terraform works with Azure cloud also. Terraform works with Google cloud also. Terraform works with on-premise also and AWS cloud also. So Terraform is going to work equally with all the cloud vendors, is going to interact with their APIs. Then again, a question might come in your mind. You may ask me that, hey, then still Terraform is, I'm writing separate set of code to interact with separate cloud API. Then what is the difference in between writing Terraform code, which is interacting with a different cloud API by some different sort of script, which is quite specific to that cloud vendor API, and writing script which is specific to that cloud vendor? So yes, my viewers, there are differences. Differences is that in order to just write ARM template from a cloud formation stack, you have to learn all at once. You have to just forget about CFT and learn all at once API, all at once ARM template. But in order to work, in order to just interact with Azure API instead of AWS API, you have to just modify only some smaller components of Terraform. Perhaps you have to make changes in Terraform provider block. You have to make changes in some small modules. You have to change. That's it. And with these changes, you will be able to work along with all the cloud vendors. That sort of benefit Terraform will be able to provide you. Okay, so what Terraform says basically, Terraform says you very simple thing. Terraform says that you no need to learn API to interact separately with AWS API, Azure API, GCP API, or on-premise. I will be actively looking for APIs related to each cloud vendor. APIs will be executed as you write any Terraform module. So what you have to do is you have to just write Terraform modules, and respective cloud vendor APIs will be executed as you write that. What you have to do being a DevOps user, what you have to do being a DevOps engineer, you being a DevOps engineer has to just create Terraform files. And once you submit that file, that module, the content of that Terraform file, the module or provider which you have defined in your Terraform file, will be used to interact with respective cloud APIs and will be creating resources for you. So this is what Terraform is. And that is where Terraform is also known as API as API as a code, right? API as a code. So just to brief what we have learned today, is what is Terraform. So what is Terraform we have learned? So first thing which we have learned is what is Terraform, wherein we have learned that Terraform is also known as infrastructure as a code. This is known as IAC, infrastructure as a code. This is also said as API as a code, because it is going to interact with respective cloud vendor APIs for you. We have also learned what are the challenges without Terraform. We have learned that without Terraform, we have to learn some script, automation script, because that is very much needed in year 2025 to survive in IT industry. You have to learn that Terraform, you have to learn that automation script specific to that cloud vendor in order to automate things. And the solution is just to write a single Terraform code, and which will be that Terraform code will be interacting with respective cloud vendors and will be creating resources for you. Okay, so this is what is the theory part of Terraform. In our tomorrow's session, I'll be talking about how the practicals of Terraform, and there I'll explain about the practicals and how to write the Terraform configuration file. Okay, thank you everyone for watching my session. So in case if you feel as if my session could be beneficial to others, your friends, please do share my videos to others and support my channel by subscribing my channel. Thank you everyone.